Okay,
Recording in progress.
so this is a piece of a collection of two sichos that we're having over here that speak about Tesvav Sivan. Tesvav Sivan, as we're going to learn about in these sichos, one from Tafshin Lamed Daled, 1974, and another one from Tafshin Mem Tes, 1989, which is how many years afterwards? 15 years later. So these two sichos are speaking about the date of Tesvav Sivan, the 15th of Sivan in 1927, Tafresh Pei Zayin, was when the previous Rebbe was arrested and taken to prison, and as they discovered later, the plan was to Chas v'Sholom have him executed. And instead of that, the Rebbe says that it was the greatest salvation came about through it. So even though externally at the time it was a negative, but that negative itself turned into a positive, as the Rebbe is going to speak about in these two sichos that we're going to quote from now. Interestingly enough, the Rebbe said a maimer before that sicha in Tafshin Lamed Daled, and then in Tafshin Mem Tes, when he spoke a different sicha about Tesvav Sivan, he gave out that maimer, or he had that maimer printed, mugadik, reviewed with footnotes and everything. As we know that even though the Rebbe said many Mamorim over the years, it was only very few relative to the many Mamorim he said that he was Magia. So there is actually a connection between these two occasions when the Rebbe spoke on Tesvav Sivan. So we will begin first of all with the Sicha that Rebbe said in Tafshin Lamed Daled. And again, the Tesvav Sivan was like by Chassidim maybe not to put it unknown date, but it wasn't a date that was marked until the Rebbe pointed out the importance of it. And even after Tafshin Lamed Daled, Tafshin Lamed Daled may have been considered like an exception, because I think the next time the Rebbe spoke about Tesvav Sivan and the importance of it was only like 15 years later. So this Sikha was like, in a way, an unusual point that the Rebbe was bringing out about Tesvav Sivan, at least on the date of Tesvav Sivan that I saw. It's known the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov on the Pasuk. It says in the Pasuk, it is a time of trouble and affliction for Yaakov, and from that trouble, he will be saved. So you can move on about Lamaiser, Vagaula, Rebbe, Hanasi, B'Mamor, Divrei Maskal, like it's brought down that there is a mimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe in Sefer Amorim Yiddish that he has on this pasuk. So the simple meaning of this pasuk is that Memenu Yivasher means that the person will be redeemed and released from the tzara. Meaning from the tzara means he will leave the tzara behind. He will leave the trouble behind. But the Baal Shem Tov teaches, Asher mimena, me hatzara atzma, from the tzara itself, from the difficulty, from the trouble itself, nasa yivasheya, comes about that he will be saved. That itself will be part of his salvation. That itself will lead to the salvation. As we see from the actual letters of the word tzara. If you switch around the combinations of the letters of the word tzara, which means trouble, and you transform it into rotza, he wanted. What does rotza mean? Rotzin chodesh l'maylam. We create from that tzara a new will above. Like we a lot of them say, many tefillas, Yehi rotzim l'fanecha, it should be the will before you. We want to make a will by Hashem to like change things from the way they are. And also from the word tzara becomes the combination of the word. If you just mix around the letters, becomes tsoyar, like it says by the teva of Noach, tsoyar tasla teva, a window or a luminous stone. Shein yonishal tsoyar or. The idea of tsoyar is light, like we say tsoyar is related to the word tsoharaim. Tsoharaim is the noonday shine, that the illumination. So we see that tzara itself, not despite the tzara we have the tsoyar. The tzara itself becomes a tsoyar, becomes a rotza. This is also one of the explanations such a kvetkus admar sipur ben gelad morazokin that the Alter Rebbe related. I'm sorry, that the Frierdiker Rebbe related concerning the Alter Rebbe. She'omar samaymar b'yoyim haravi shel achre yutes kislev, that he said a maimer relating to his release from prison. So he said this maimer after Yutes Kislev, on the Wednesday after Kislev. What's the significance? The Alter Rebbe explained, or that the Alter Rebbe said the maimer on Wednesday. V'amar oz admur hazokin. So the Alter Rebbe said at that time, Asher b'yoyim haravi nitlu ha'ma'oris betes. In the fourth day, it says that we know that the luminaries, the physical sun and the moon, were hung up in the heavens on Wednesday. So, and there you could spell it with a tes or you could spell it with a tuf. Nitlu betes means they were removed, they were lacking, just like the moon became lacking and deficient and decreased. But spiritually, in the world, in the present, the Wednesday was a day when the luminaries were removed. What does that mean? Hakavon, the intention of the Alter Rebbe was li'istalkos haBaal Shem Tov b'yom daled aleph de Chag HaShavuos. His intention was, his meaning was, the passing of the Baal Shem Tov on Wednesday, which was the first day of the Yom Tov of Shavuos. And he said also, the Oz b'yom haravi, then on Wednesday, gam nitlu ha'ma'oris b'tov. Also, the ma'oris, the luminaries, were hung in the heavens, the opposite of nitlu. Nitlu means they were removed, a negative, and nitlu means hung, that they were there. That's what the Alter Rebbe said. The Rebbe is explaining what the Alter Rebbe is saying now. Shabir bezar de pashtasu, the simple explanation in what the Alter Rebbe was saying. Shal achre Yutes Kislev, after the 19th of Kislev, which was the imprisonment of the Alter Rebbe and his release. So now the true idea of the spreading of the well springs became in an unbelievable fashion after Yutes Kislev. Like it's known, the Sicha of the Rebbe Rashab in Torah Shalom, where he explains this even more. So it's the same idea, just like we said, from the Tzara becomes Ratza and Tzoyar, the same thing. The Wednesday that was the Baal Shem Tov's passing has to do with the Wednesday of the past after Yutes Kislev, where they became, instead of Chassidus being affected negatively in the passing, it's actually a growth, and it becomes an increase in the idea of spreading Chassidus. So the Rebbe says this is a lesson for us in our lives, having to do very much connected with Simcha and Bitochon. And so too in every matter that becomes a trouble for a Yid. So afterwards becomes that from it, the very trouble itself causes and brings about the salvation. The very darkness itself becomes transformed to light, and the bitterness itself becomes sweet. And not just does it become any type of light and any type of sweetness, and with an additional increase, just like the increase and the greater light that comes out of darkness is much greater than the light that does not have darkness beforehand. So therefore, it's not just that we are taking the tzara and we're making it into tzoyar, we're taking the darkness and transforming it into light, but by having the darkness that we're transforming into light, so now we have a much greater light than we had before, that was even possible if you wouldn't have had the darkness. And just like it's so when it says about Yisro Na'oira B'Matach HaChoshech, Val Derech Zeh, in a similar vein, B'Negel L'Meriru Misku, concerning bitter and sweet, that what we gain and what we have in the bitter, from the bitter becoming the sweet, is much greater sweetness than if it would be ordinary sweetness without the bitterness preceding it. So that's the whole advantage of having the tzara being transformed to good. So in a similar vein, the Rebbe now brings this concerning the imprisonment of the Frierdiker Rebbe on the 15th of Sivan. So too it's the time when the moon is full. The 15th of the month is always the time when the moon is full, indicating completion, perfection. Yidden are likened to the moon, so the fullness of the moon shows an ascendancy. The idea that the moon is full is the 15th of every month. In the month, that's the idea of the Yidden, that they counted the moon. So therefore also the Yidden are in a full and complete and perfect state. So how does that fit in with the date that the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested? So too it's concerning the 15th of Sivan. On the 15th of Sivan was the beginning of the imprisonment of my father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe. Also then, it came out in the days of the week, like in this year, Teslav Sivan b'yom haravi. It was actually on a Wednesday also. So now, this year, it's a Wednesday. When the Rebbe spoke about it in Tafshin Lamed Daled in 1974, it was a Wednesday. And when it originally happened in 1927 in Tafresh Pei Zayin, it was also on a Wednesday, which we know already. The Alter Rebbe established that Wednesday has this type of contrast type of thing, that it could be taken away, and that itself leads to being hung the luminaries, to be revealed the luminaries. Let's skip over the brackets to the next page. And then he says after the brackets, after we had the idea of what took place on the 15th of Sivan, Yotza Lepoil, it came out in actuality, through that sprouted a special day, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz, Chag HaGeula, the 12th and the 13th of Tammuz, the day of redemption, the Yom Tov redemption. And the one who was imprisoned and redeemed, in other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe, connects the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, the Chag HaGeula, with the idea of the 15th of Sivan. And explains that at the time when the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested, one did not see the concealed light in it. It was a tzara, it was a trouble, it was a terrible time for Yidden. The Frierdiker Rebbe was in danger of being killed. Masha'enkin la'achriz and Nizgal Adov, as opposed to afterwards, the great light of the 15th of Sivan was revealed. After this took place the first time around, in a way of concealment and covering in the literal sense, where it was literally a big tzara on the 15th of Sivan. So after that, in times following, every year past the original 15th of Sivan of 1927, it's sufficient that the concealment should be in the idea of the understanding of the matter. So the Rebbe is going to explain a very interesting concept over here. The Rebbe is going to say that in truth, we know, the Rebbe always emphasizes this, all events that took place in the past, that are celebrated in Torah and mitzvahs, are things that repeat again and again. And the Therefore, by extension, the events that lead up to that celebration also repeat themselves again and again. So the Rebbe is going to give an example from Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's not just that every year on the 15th of Nisan, the date of Pesach, we are experiencing again Yetzias Mitzrayim, but beforehand there is the idea of Golus Mitzrayim. Except that the Golus Mitzrayim, how do we fulfill this now? How do we experience Golus Mitzrayim now? Not in the physical trouble of Golus Mitzrayim, but in a spiritual sense, as we will soon explain. So the Rebbe says the same idea, even though now, Baruch Hashem, we don't have a Tes Vav Sivan in the physical tzara, the physical troubles, but there is the Tes Vav Sivan experience on the spiritual sense to lead to the greater elevation of the 12th and 13th of Tammuz. So let's see how the Rebbe applies this concerning Yetzias Mitzrayim. He says on the third paragraph of the page, similar to what we say concerning the Golus of Mitzrayim, then it was literally difficult work in the simple sense. There was literally mortar and bricks. As opposed in the exile afterwards, it's sufficient if we have the mortar and the bricks in the understanding of the Torah. What does that mean, mortar and bricks in the understanding of the Torah? Because the Zohar says that when it says that they were enslaved with mortar, that means they were working their minds. They were working hard. They had avodah kasha, but they were using the tool of kal v'chomer. If this is so how much more so something else? Ubelevenim, working with bricks. So the word levenim is the word white, lavan. That means dal libun hilchas avachul. This means clarifying the halacha. So instead of having the physical toil of Egypt, physical labor in the simple sense, the labor and toil that we must have now should only be and will only be, and this should only be focused on the toil of the mind, the toil of the spirit, to work on reaching greater and greater heights. Meaning, to remove all the concealments and coverings that there are in the understanding and comprehension of Torah. This is a replacement for the idea of the mortar and bricks that took place when there was actual mortar and bricks in Mitzrayim. With all the details that he enumerates further, that there's more details about the enslavement, like it's explained in the Alter Rebbe's Torah, in those Mamorim that focus on it, that explains the spiritual corresponding levels of all the different descriptions of toil that went on in Mitzrayim. From this understood to all matters of concealments and covering. Though it may start off, or though it may have one time have been something in the physical sense, it can be replaced with, and it in the next time around, in the next round, in the spiritual time around, so then it's just done in the spiritual levels. So that's what the Rebbe applies this also concerning the 15th of Sivan. From this is also understood concerning the 15th of the day of the month of Sivan. In the original time, in 1927, there was a literal physical concealment and covering, physical danger to the Frierdiker Rebbe. In every year following that, what it's sufficient. The fact that we lack understanding, why, a deep understanding, a real understanding, why did this have to be so? Because why it had to be in such a manner. So that is our, if you will, suffering of the 15th of Sivan. That we are suffering over not understanding why this is so. And the main thing is Havana b'negel lepoil, understanding concerning the actuality. She'inyan zatzarich lifoil hisoiris limud aTorah v'kiyam mitzvahs. This has to affect the inspiration for studying Torah and fulfilling mitzvahs. Skip the parentheses. V'zeu gama inyan hakloli shel yiridas haneshama beguf. Similar to the imprisonment of the 15th of Sivan is, in a broad sense, the imprisonment of the neshama coming down into the body. I feel in the neshama shel tzaddik gomer ovid b'yirav avarav b'tanugim, even the neshama of a great tzaddik who serves Hashem with awe and a pleasurable love. Gam zen nikra b'shem yirida kimevur betanya. It's still such an idea of considered descent for him to come down, even though he has this great love and awe of Hashem. Ki gam hu yesh misha he still has an existence, an ego that is loving Hashem. V'niten lotzis b'zei dechoiv al kol inin hayirida, and that should be sufficient to fulfill the entire idea of the descent. That should be the worst descent that we go through. We shouldn't have to descend any lower than just being an ego that is loving. In other words, there's chas v'shalom other types of descents we should go through. We shouldn't have that. And the purpose of that is, like every descent of the neshama into this world, to reach an ascent higher than the place from which it descended from. Like explained earlier in the Maimer that the Rebbe said at the beginning of this Fabrengen, that the neshama that was placed into me is even higher than the level of Ata Barasa. You created it, so we're reaching a level that's higher than its original source. And the Rebbe says, and the parenthesis says, this is from a Sicha of Tesvav Sivan Tafshin Lamed Dalet. 15 years later, in Tafshin Memtes, the Rebbe speaks about this again, and he had given out a mimer, that mimer that he had. That very mimer that he had said in 15 years earlier, he reviewed and had published that. I don't mean giving out as in literally giving out. I'm not sure that year the Rebbe gave out the mimer in a booklet, but the point is that he had published the same mimer of that Fabrengen with notes and so on, and completely redone like the Mugadikim Amarim were. So in that occasion, the Rebbe said a Sicha. And it was again the 15th of Sivan, Tafshin Memtes, 1989. Ois Aleph, Yedua ha'inyan da'yomim elun niskarim v'aydeis v'naisim. It's known, what the Baal Shem Tov explains, that it says in the Megillah that these days are remembered. And the Baal Shem Tov explains that when we remember a particular occasion on the Jewish calendar, so then they occur again. It's not just something that happened in the past. Therefore, since the remembrance brings about that it recurs, therefore, that we have to remind ourselves and we have to mention the events of these days, in other words, the date that we're in, so that they should occur again. And as soon as possible, skip the parentheses. So that it should happen again. All those great and good things that came about in the first time around. It should be even a greater way than it was the first time around. Concerning our topic, which is in the night of the 15th of Sivan, in other words, last night, the night going into the 15th of Sivan, occurred a very general event and unique by my father-in-law, the leader of our generation. The Rebbe says in the parentheses, initially, what was only seen was the negative. Afterwards, it was clarified that from this grew out a great salvation, like we will say further on. An event that's applicable to the entire generation. Koloimer, this means to say, nois v'lakach. Shekol in Yonav shel Nesiat Doir, it's supposed to say Hadoir, it's supposed to be a Reish, not a Dalet. Shayachim l'chol Hadoir mekivim sha'nasiu ha'koil, all of the matters of the leader of the generation are associated with the entire generation. Why mekivim sha'nasiu ha'koil? Since the Nasi is everything, so that includes every event that happens to the leader. Harei bein hamorois shuvameshch mechayev shal nasi yeshnam beribu inyanim sheichusam mechal hadoir einam b'chadgosh kol kach. Amongst all the events that took place throughout the lifetime of the leader of the generation, there are many things that their connection with the generation is not emphasized so much. V'yeshnam morois miyuchadim k'venidin dedan. They are unique and specific and special events. Like in our case, that we're going to talk about now, the 15th of Sivan, shebehem mudgeshes beyoyser hashaychus l'chol hador, than them is emphasizes even more the connection with the entire generation. That's why there has to be the idea that these days are remembered and they are done, because it's so important that this is something that recurs for us, that we re-experience. And especially Shebekesher Lemura Zeh, in connection with this event, Mudgish Beyoisera Inyan the Niskadim V'Naisim is even more emphasized, the idea they are remembered and they are done. There are events that their effect is for their time. And afterwards there's like a remnant of it that remains an ongoing thing. The only way how we know to give it significance is because it says in the pasuk that we have to remember it and then it recurs. Avol yesh meurois, but there are events like in our case, shebahem royim begolui, that in them we see in a revealed way shebachol shana naisim, that in every year they are recurring. Loidak ba'ifin the pulan imshechas ma'ashanim shalifnei zad lapama rishoyin, and not just that they are a continuation of what took place the first time around from the years prior to that, el ba'ifin mechudish kidla kaman, but they're actually in a renewed way, like we're about to say. Base b'layla zeh, and this night, the Rebbe I think said the Sicha in the night going into the 15th of Sivan. I believe so. So the Rebbe says that in the night of this night, Oil Chamishas B'Sivan, the night going into the 15th of Sivan, Mishnaf Tafrish Bezayin, in the year 1927, Shesimona Prozois, that it's the sign of that year is open, released, in other words, free, without enclosure. Was the beginning of the well-known imprisonment of my father-in-law, the leader of our generation. During the actual event of the imprisonment, they only saw the negative of it. An untoward thing. In other words, in a just using very minimalist language. In other words, it was much worse than just saying bilti rotzi, untoward. Ad kedei kach, to such a degree, shebola de bitui bin tfilos b'koshes, that it was such a terrible situation that there was all types of tfilos that we daven, a request from Hashem. Ki yedum, of course, like it's known and well known what took place at that time, how the Yidden were in an uproar over the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest. Al b'soifi shel davar, but eventually noichul adas, they became obvious. Shemeura zeh hevi l'shua gedolah, this event brought a great salvation. What was the great salvation? Through that was enabled the exodus of the Frierdiker Rebbe from that country. Both him and his family, which is also including the Rebbe. The Rebbe, if not for the arrest of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and then afterwards they wanted to get the Frierdiker Rebbe out of the country as soon as possible after he was released. So the Rebbe was as well sent off as being part of the household of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So therefore, it means that our Rebbe released from Russia because of the arrest that took place on this date, on the 15th of Sivan. So that was a very big Hatzalah that came out from the arrest on the 15th of Sivan. And not just him and his family, all of his Sfarim and his manuscripts and his entire possession. If you go according to the order of the country and the laws of the government of the Soviet Union, it was impossible for all these things to take place, that the families should leave and the possession should leave and people should leave, if not for the event that took place on the 15th of Sivan. Through this, he came to a place and an order in life that he would be able to be involved in all of his matters that the Frierdiker Rebbe was involved in. Beginning from his primary involvement, spreading the well springs outward, amongst the idea of spreading the Yiddishkeit outward. In other words, spreading Chassidus amongst the whole general thing of spreading Yiddishkeit. Bali kol hagbolos, that he came to a place, in other words, the United States, where he could do so without any limitations, increasing and illuminating further and further, until we see it even now, the continuation and the growth of spreading Chassidus and spreading Yiddishkeit. The beginning of the salvation was on the 3rd of Tammuz, where the Frierdiker Rebbe was saved from execution, and instead he was sent to exile in Kostroma. Adli Mehagula Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, until the days of redemption of the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, when he's completely released from any type of control. Shenasi Yom Tov L'Mei Yisrael B'chol Olam Kuli became a Yom Tov for Yidden in the entire world. V'hoylech Mispashet, and this is continuing to grow and expand this Yom Tov amongst many, many Jews. Behesem L'tzivi V'Iroz Balamaiser V'Agula, corresponding to the command and directive of the one who is imprisoned and redeemed, Shafat Sayadis V'Mayonis, the way how the Yiddishkeit should be spread and the well springs of Chassidus should be spread. You ba'ofen shel soif kol soif yachduretz kol b'nei Yisrael mamish. Eventually, it should permeate all Yidden. So the same thing, the Yom Tov of Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz is something that is reaching more and more Yidden to reach the ultimate that all Yidden should be reached over there. So the Rebbe says in Ois Gimel, 2 paragraphs on the bottom, from this understood also concerning these days, that these days are remembered and done, and by first prefacing. Concerning the general idea of Golus, the imprisonment we find, the first time around, Golus Mitzrayim, there had to be the difficulty of the enslavement in the literal sense. They had to be with mortar, and they had to be in bricks, and they had to be in difficult labor, like we were mentioning this in the previous Sicha. But after the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, as a precursor to the ongoing, annual, even daily Yetzias Mitzrayim, the enslavement is not to be in the physical. We do this all in the spiritual. Through toiling and Torah study. Like the Zohar says, the word chaymer, which means mortar, means the kal v'chaymer study of learning Torah, and the bricks, which is related to the word love and white. That's the clarification, the whitening of the halacha. Like the Alter Rebbe explains in Torah. This means as follows: the first time around when there was Yitzias Mitzrayim, there couldn't have been the difficult enslavement in the spiritual. It had to be in the physical sense. It had to be the literal type of enslavement, that physically Yidden were enslaved. What's the proof? Perhaps we could have had it otherwise, which seems to be indicated in some places. So the Rebbe says, the very fact that in actuality there was the physical enslavement. It's understood and it's obvious that Hashem will not cause suffering to a Yid, especially to the entire nation of the Yidden. If there's any type of way that it can be done without any suffering, And the Rebbe says in the brackets, and the fact that Yaakov Avinu was scared about going down to Mitzrayim, even though he surely knew what Avraham Avinu was told that they will enslave them, because he thought that we don't need to have the physical enslavement. He felt that maybe we can manage without the physical enslavement. We could do it only spiritually, but that was incorrect. The physical enslavement was necessary the first time around. Skip the bracket, skip that paragraph. Aval. After there was the difficult enslavement in the literal sense, so then there's no further need to do this again, heaven forbid. We affect this in our spiritual avodah, like we said before. What does it mean that they did it? That's kal v'chomer, the toiling in Torah. Why is it this way? Why is there such a difference? We've established that it must be that way. But why was there a difference? Why the first time around did it have to be the physical difficulty, and the future times it's not necessary? Yesh loimer, the Rebbe says we can say shesibus hashinu, the cause of the difference is hachidush the Matan Torah. That is the accomplishment that Matan Torah accomplished. Then it was nullified the decree that those above shall not ascend below, and those below will not ascend above. So therefore, once that decree was removed, so the spiritual can take the place of the physical. But before that decree, what I'm doing in my spiritual is not going to affect my physical. So therefore, it was necessary for the physical imprisonment. Therefore, once the Torah was given, we could affect the idea of the enslavement in spiritual toil and would accomplish the same thing like physical toil, because there's no separation between the spiritual and the physical. So the Rebbe goes on and says, concerning the 15th of Sivan, which was a physical tzara, but in future times, it doesn't have to be physical anymore. So the Rebbe says in the last paragraph, but this is also understood concerning the imprisonment of the leader of our generation, the 15th of Sivan. Though the first time around, it had to be in such a way that was connected with the physical suffering of the body. The proof that it had to be that way, because in actuality it was that way, like we said before about Mitzrayim. Like the Rebbe said earlier, this is something that we need to break our heads over. It is something that puzzles us and makes us toil and hurts our brain to understand why did the Frierdiker Rebbe have to go through such physical suffering. Why couldn't it have been accomplished without the need for physical suffering? Yet, though that was then, since then, there's no need to have something similar to that. And from now on, the period doesn't belong over there. We affect this in the spiritual service. Since we find ourselves already post the time of the giving of the Torah. Every single year it increases in the nullification of the decree. The Rebbe gives an interesting insight over here. It's not just that 3,300 plus years ago the decree stopped, but it was completely stopped. It was not just completely stopped, but there's further and further levels of Elyonim and Tachtoinim being joined greater and greater, that the spiritual and the physical coalesce and join more and more after the cessation of the decree that took place by Matan Torah. Especially in this year, in the year Tafshin Mem Tes, was 3,300 years of since the giving of the Torah. The imprisonment was specifically by the leader of our generation, that it says, Asher Cholenu, our illness, an illness that was supposed to come upon us. Who nasa? He carried our illness. He suffered for us. Including also nasa from the word raising up and lifting up. Hainu sheigbiya sonu shmekanu lahabel in starach linyom digbosum, by him carrying our illness. So he raised us up that we should not have to go through anything similar to this. Kiyim ba'avodah beruchnius, and only in our spiritual avodah. And let's skip over to the bottom of the page, 2 paragraphs on the bottom. Tesla of Sivan Ascholos HaMaiser Vageula, the 15th of Sivan, the beginning of the imprisonment and the redemption, Mahava Hira V'Nesinas Koyach, shows the idea of and the lesson and the empowerment called Echad Ve'echad to every single one, L'maleh B'kosher Nafshi Shebal Maiser Vageula, to fulfill the sole request of the one whose imprisonment was and redemption took place. Shekol Echad Ve'echad Yasik B'Afot Samayonis Chutza. Every single person should be involved in spreading the well springs outward. Ka'amr, like we said earlier, Hein Benegel La'atzmai, both concerning himself, Hein Benegel L'Pul Al Azulas, both concerning his influence on another. V'inyan Zeh Shayach L'Chol Echad Ve'echad Yisrael. This is connected to every single Yid, Hanoshim V'Anoshim, men and women, K'meduber Kamapamim, like it's spoken about many times. In Yonim Damunas Hashem, Avas Hashem V'Yiros V'Kiyotz Possession, His Bara B'Teres Chassidus, matters of belief in Hashem, love of Hashem, and His awe, that's explained in the teaching of Chassidus, is something that's not limited only to men. Shayochim la'anoshim v'noshim b'shava, are equally applicable to men and women, because it's part of the 6 mitzvahs that are mitzvahs tmidiyas. They are constant mitzvahs that women are also obligated in. V'chein b'negel lataf, also concerning children, we have to teach them about love and awe and belief in Hashem, b'tor chinuch, out of education. But in the full force and the full perfection, gam b'negel lafot sambiyonis chutz, also concerning the well springs outward, the spreading of the well springs. Like we said before, Baal Maiser Agula Amar, the one whose imprisonment and redemption said, Shafot Sayadis Mayonis Tachter Sefke Soifet Chob Neisrom Mamish, that spreading Yiddishkeit and the well springs of Chassidus will permeate every single person of the Yidden in actuality. Regardless of how his father acted or his grandfather acted, or even the way he himself acted a day prior to this day, we tell him that he has to fulfill the sole mission and job of spreading Yiddishkeit, the spreading the well springs outward. And he's promised that if you toil, you will reach, you will find even before the finding. As long as the toil is not complete, according to the suffering is the reward. Even the reward that's lower than something that's a found object is according to the way that Eibishter understands reward. Since the workers are the children of the Avis, the daughters of Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, also the women have to be involved in spreading Yiddishkeit and the well springs outward. We'll stop over here.